Well, welcome to you all. I'm Chris Cowden. I'm the Director of Women in Their Work, and I'm so glad you're here. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion, and I hope that we'll have a lot of exchange. I think this is a really rich topic and a lot to talk about. So I'm going to start by just introducing Alex Robinson, and then she's going to introduce our panelists. So Alex grew up all over the world, and this informs her work. Her dad was in the military, so she's a military family moving often. Her father was raised as a Jew, and her mother is from Mexico. And so this was a pairing that maybe both of their parents weren't so excited about. Is that an issue?
Actually, no, that's okay, but it's an interesting part of the conversation.
Yeah, so anyway, there was they married, and so she was raised with different cultures in different parts of the world throughout her life. So this is going to be part of a really rich discussion. So Alex went to college in St. Mary's, and then she received an MFA from the University of Cincinnati. She's shown in many places all over the country, and we are so lucky to have her here. So join me in welcoming Alex Robinson to one
I want to thank Women in Their Work. This has been like 2 years, I think, on the books, and we all know what COVID is. So I just think it's kind of wild that it's actually happening. But let me introduce the panel, and then we can kind of enter the conversation through the performance. But so we have Annette Carlozzi is a curator here, and prolific, I feel like, always. She was a part of a Crit Group. That's how I met Annette, and I always think that you have, like, I've said this to you before, but like real gems of information to offer up in the conversation, and it's stuff I think about a lot and for long periods of time. So I'm really excited that you were able to join. And then we have Isabel Servantez, who's a curator here in town, and new to the Austin scene, really, but like coming in, fighting. So I'm so excited that you took my cold email. And then we have Anthony García, who is an artist and curator here in town. And I think that the things that you're making on identity and all the conversations and things over the years that we've talked about have been really interesting. I'm really happy that you're here as well. And then Jackson Harrington is the last one over there, and also an artist and is the director, is that how you call it? Executive director of the Museum of Pocket Art, which many of you have already been looking at. And if you don't know what that is, you should ask him what that is so you can see it. But thank you all for agreeing to do this panel. So what I thought we could do is we would like to be able to offer space for questions from the audience. So if there are things that we're saying that are curious to you, or you want some more information, please raise your hand and let us know that you want to speak up. But I'd like to begin the conversation by using the performance of the girls as a jumping off point. I think about what it means to communicate, how complicated that can be. So the girls were clearly communicating something, even if we don't necessarily recognize what exactly they were communicating. They were wearing ponchos that can be recognized as culturally specific, but this also can go unnoticed for the various details in the color. The title of the work itself, which is Americana or Americana, is suggestive of a play on meaning. So it can be relying on the Spanish word for an American, or it can also be construed as the way that we think about Americana objects within a context of culture, history, folklore, that we sort of think about as like of the United States or belonging to America. So what I thought I would do is sort of place that and open it up to Annette and to Isabel to sort of talk about this idea of an institution, the institution of artist or the institution of curator, and how that sort of enters into these larger ideas. Well, I guess from my perspective, I was thinking about the institution of what it means to be like labeled as something, whether you're Mexican American, or even the complication of language, like what do you use as an identifier, but then also thinking about the institution of the American experience. I don't know, whatever that means to anybody specifically.
And one of the things that occurs to me is that even as we talk about identifiers, there are, of course, multiple identifiers, and it's the layer of all of that that makes one story unique. And as an artist, that's information you have to explore and elaborate on. One of the layers of you and your work that is not always part of the common scenario is that you're a parent. And I see often in the work that you have incorporated your children, your experiences with your daughters, you've invited them to make their play part of what you do, you just choreograph them in something that further elaborates this work on the wall. If it wasn't entirely clear, that's what was happening out there. And for me, just to go to the big picture to start, if I could for a second, the big picture of those identities is we're human, and that artists are, for lack of a better term, citizens living in the world who are functioning in all the sort of active and survival ways, well, curators too for that matter, but all the survival ways that everyone else is. So I look for points of commonality and see how they're described kind of uniquely from different perspectives. And that's just the piece I'd like to start on, because I know we'll become more specific than that in the conversation.
Sure.
I work a lot with Latinx art and artists, and something that we're navigating right now is these terms, right? Like Latinx, Hispanic, Mexican American, Chicana. So I really enjoy that work. Like being able to be open to something that's multivariate with Americana or Americana. I really enjoy how open that is to interpretation from different points of view. Something that we're, I don't know if we're struggling with it, but it is changeable, flexible. So I think it's really nice. It's really nice, a nice opening for your show.
I mean, one of the things I do think about with labels, we've talked about labels. I mean, we were on a whole, I mean, it wasn't specifically, I guess, about labels with the Latinos Who Lunch podcast, but I think it's part of it. But I remember I went to a conversation that was happening down at the School of the Southwest with the curator. Who was the curator that did the? Yeah, recently. So it was she had been at Bemis, I think, and took time to curate an exhibition that was using the through line of like migration, but doing it through the lens of like the monarch butterfly as a pathway. And so they had invited like anyone who wanted to participate that felt like they belonged to this list of labels, whether it was like anything that Isabel just listed, or if you just identify as brown or black or whatever. And like that was super fascinating because everybody in the room had agency to be there, but everybody struggled with the label that they appropriated. And so like even with this show, with this idea of Americana or Mexican American, like I've tried not to, like I think in hashtags I'll use Latinx because it's like this envelope of space, but then I'm like, I don't, like if that is also a complication of a label. And so I've like tried to specifically use Mexican American, and I think like in some ways it's generational as far as like my upbringing as an American kid with a Mexican background, but also other backgrounds. And so like trying to figure out like what does that mean and how do I place that in space? And I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, it speaks to something I'm actually dealing with right now. I just turned in my thesis for my master's, and part of it was discussing trying to find a term that I can associate with books, and one that I kind of pushed away for a long time was Chicano, just because I felt.
Can you speak a little louder?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. So the idea of Chicano didn't quite sit with me because I think aesthetically my work doesn't quite fit within that realm. So I was kind of playing with that in grad school a little bit too, and so I'm kind of coming to this conclusion
What it is to be an American, and being Mexican American and the history of like Mexican Americans trying to find validity in this country by joining service, and not just Mexican Americans, but lots of people of color trying to find some equitable life in this country by having military service in their backgrounds. So I think it's interesting how open it is to a different, to me as seeing this show, to maybe a person that doesn't have a military like upbringing.
Yeah.
I think there's just something there that's really interesting, and like it's not quite reverent, but like gives you space to like to think about those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say that I did want because like every single one of us has a sense of what it means to be from here, even if we don't like it, or if we're from multiple places. And then the granularity of it is that, well, yes, and then you're from like, maybe you're from Texas, or maybe you're from some other place, and then you're from the town that you're from, and then you're from your family, and then I think like going off what you're talking about when we were talking previous to this, Robert, we were talking about like colorism within a family. Within the structure of your family, there's like, even then segmented spaces for how you sort of belong or don't belong.
I mean, what I love about your show and your work in general is that you use language, and it's really core to what you're doing. And it shifted my perceptions, and it's also opened up a lot of ideas, which makes me excited for your work. So it's like, this is the kind of work I want to explore. So along what you're saying, this idea of identity, and how do we create that is by using labels.
Yeah.
And so we label ourselves as identity, but what's so great about like the military and about the flag and about the semaphore is that there's an obvious communication to those who know, but there's an outsider who was unfamiliar with like the symbolism of what 3 stripes on a sleeve mean or whatever.
Yeah.
There's like inaccessibility that occurs when crossing dialogue or crossing cultures or groups. And I think what you were getting about with us is that friction of when they do come across each other and they try to mesh and blend together. But then on top of that, there's still that identity of being so mixed, mestizo.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, there's like the European influence, and then there's the native influence. So you get, like within my own family, where I'm the güero, the white guy, but my sister is super chocolatey. So much so that in high school, she filled a tub and put bleach in it so she could lighten her skin. And I don't say that to be like shocking or whatever. It's just, but that's the range that occurs within even one family, where I have cousins with green eyes and blue eyes and blonde hair, but speak pure Spanish. Well, not pure Spanish, that's not such thing, but really well Spanish. So yeah, I mean, and again, going back to the book, and I revisited for this talk, and I loved that she was talking about the language of El Pachuco, and I was like, see, you got me going all over the place. So like, those are all words I grew up with in El Paso. That's like, it's part of the Spanish. It's that Spanglish.
Yeah.
So like words like instead of pila for battery, we say bateria, or suéter for sweater. It's like
The Spanish, like, yes, like there's all kinds of weird.
yeah, but there's that blending of made-up words that make sense
Yeah.
in the context. But then there was also the secret language of like El Chuco, which was like trusha, aguas. Like trusha is like put yourself on watch, be careful. Aguas is be careful or look out. You know, and these were languages that I grew up. This was the language that I grew up with in elementary, high school. This is just secondary. And I think that's what's so neat about what I'm making these connections to with your work, is that this idea of language is hidden,
Yeah.
but also apparent to those who know how to read it.
Yeah.
But and if I'm sorry, I'm going back to the performance with the Americana. like, when you told me the name of it, it shifted in me because, yeah, growing up in El Paso, you go back and forth on the border, go visit family, come back and forth, and you always declare your nationality.
Yeah.
We always declared Americano, which is like weird. You're supposed to say United States, because you're not. Americano is the whole continent.
Yeah.
It's not the country, which is what they want you to say, but you just said Americano. I'm stuck. Americana, in the English pronunciation, Americana
Yeah.
is, to me, growing up, hillbilly country music.
Yeah.
Or craft and that stuff. But that needs to be redefined, and it's being redefined now to include like blues, all kinds of other types of music genres and other types of craft work that's being made. All that's to say is I never considered it in that way because I'm Americano. And it never occurred to me, Americana, like to play with the word, because I identify male.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what you were saying, Isabel, which is the use of the X, the Latino, Latina, and how we identify.
Sure.
So again, it's labeling and introduction, why things mean what they mean, how we get them.
I mean, I think like, so, you know, I think we're all of a single generation, and Isabel's about 10-something years younger, and when it comes to like how, like this idea of labels for specifically Mexican American or whatever language you want to use, but like my generation, at least in my experience, was raised without language because we lived in a place, and so when we would go back to my grandparents' house, it's like Spanglish and everything and is around. My mother was raised, like Spanish is her first language, but I also think like, what I find fascinating about the generation younger is that in research, because I have a colleague who's doing research about the female-male like language barrier, I don't know, of Spanish, and how women are appropriating that words that would typically be like Americano, that would be typically male in a female way. And so yeah, that's really interesting that it is gendered too. It's like not just this, it's that. And I think that's that's a really wild way to think about it. Because it didn't even occur to me to think about it from the male. Well, I don't know what it's like to be male, so I don't know what it's like to be the male perspective.
The work is that now you're opening up those pathways and
Yeah.
the dialogues which need to be happening. Yeah.
Just a quick thought, two thoughts. They were there, and now the whole conversation has landed there. I'm thinking of Celia Alvarez Munoz, who is finally kind of revered older conceptual Latina artist who played with this kind of plays, continues to play with this kind of slyness of language and its multiple meanings. And really, at the time when she began in the early 80s, studying under Vernon Fisher, of all people, learned that language was slippery, and she had super skills, having grown up as she had, to put that out in a political way in her work. So Celia comes to mind, and then that relates to, I'm just looking at these as I'm looking at y'all, the kind of slippery genderedness of this work as I see it in many ways, but specifically, I think of military. To me, that's a male construction. You have explored it in these works of art using these Betsy Ross kind of female touch skills, and so you've embedded in the very display, to use an old military word, the very display of these things, you've embedded a kind of female gendered touch in all the different ways. of
Yeah,
doing
I
this.
haven't-
And that's another kind of sly, kind of slippery way that the word speaks. And women in their work also that much to say.
That's such a great little like drop. Betsy Ross, the founding of the country, is like, oh, this is a great connection.
No, I thought I saw somebody with
I was thinking about Alexandra. I think I'm wrestling a lot with, because I work in a museum, but I don't come from the family of artists or art professionals. I know a lot about code switching.
Yeah.
And then also do writers like her, like I think like James Baldwin, that were unapologetically wrote to specific audiences. So it's like it's kind of a meme now, but it's like if you know, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting in your work, and that you're working on choice of titles like Americana or Americana. That if you have that experience as a woman, I assume, then you have more insight into that than I would. As a man, it's really gives you. It kind of leaves some people out, but I think that's good, actually.
Right? Like I don't have to invite
You don't have to invite
everyone.
These are, none of these thoughts are actively happening in the studio as things are being made, by the way. It's just like the need.
But because you haven't been invited either. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that this space needs to exist.
Yeah,
True.
right?
It's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that even connects to like the subtitle of the show, which is words to live by.
Yeah.
Which is like, things that can like guide you, words that can guide you, but also I think like proximity, words that you live by, and like maybe you don't understand the word, you don't understand the language.
Yeah.
But we all coexist even though we have different languages.
Yeah. I mean, even that the word delimitations, the construct of it is like a political one because it's usually used, illegally used, but like to delineate a voting area or like a constituency.
Mm-hmm.
And so like this, and that group changes depending on who's in charge. And so that to me is real interesting, which in my mind also directly relates to this idea of like a military campaign to sort of move, in this case, west, right? And like, but it also made me think about the way that like Spanish settlers would move into an area. They would send, like a religious context first, and then they would develop like a hacienda or and then eventually the presidio would come, and then it would be like a village. But they would slowly like build into the place. It's sort of I don't know. Well, it would assert itself, I guess, is how I think about it. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have to invite everybody. I didn't really think about it that way, but that's really interesting to think about it that way.
I think it's okay to be selective.
Yeah.
Art. I know it's not intentional, but I think it's okay for the artwork to be selected. Seems like I gave it like.
No, but I always think about it. It's its own thing, and
Give
you
it
follow
some-
the
yeah.
thing, right? Yeah.
Gave it agency.
Yulia?
Do you feel that using this work helps you clarify some of the ideas about identity, or do you realize the complexity?
I think it both. It helped clarify for myself that I'm okay with labels, and I'm okay with like old labels that are very like Chicana or Mexican American, but I don't want to use like Hispanic anymore. I like Latinx, but so yes, but it also made me realize that I can't forsake one for the other. So like in the conversation we often talk, and I think it's location, like we're talking about the Mexican American experience in the context of this, but like my father's, the way my dad grew up, and he's culturally a Jew, and so like the legacy of that I carry, I will never give that up because it's the burden. I mean, we all have a sense of the history of the Jewish experience around the world for eons, and so it's like that I can't give that up. And so like to celebrate both, and to do it through a lens that, like you were saying at the beginning, many of these communities in the 50s, and from the 30s to the 50s, were like, and even now, are like choosing a military experience as a way to lift out of poverty or to give agency to their family, and I'm like a perfect example of that. But so yeah, no, I mean, the other thing it did was realize like, oh, as I see another person, I can never assume. It's much more complicated, and you never know whatever their burden is that they're carrying around within that context. And it's like, so there's some sense of empathy, but I would like others to have that sense too, so I don't know.
But I think I think that it encourages you to educate yourself more about your heritage, right?
Yeah, like in 2020, I started, I was on sabbatical and I decided to take a class. It was an introduction to history of Latinx, Chicanx. And every day I called my mother after class and I was like, so these decisions that you made were like directly related to da 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 da, and I would just run through the thing and she's like, yes. And I was like, wow. And it just changed my entire frame of reference because like the last conversation I had with her was a few months ago about this specifically, but like my grandfather has a 3rd grade education. He was a sheep shearer, which means he was probably doing legacy work from his family. And this is like hundreds of miles worth of ranches around the Brackettville area. And somewhere in the 50s, he decided to lift his family out and move north to Colleen. And he got a job at Fort Hood painting cars. And it's like, how did he drive 400 miles north in the 50s? Like, that's a very big distance, you know? And so I think about like, who was there before that like helped him find the job. It's like the way that we think about receiving family members if you have family that are coming from other countries, but the way that we think about refugees, like helping them like lift up. I think about it when we're educating students. Like if you come from a family that doesn't have a background in education or like university education, like how do you show your student that there's another level that they can aspire to, that they don't just have to like stop questioning the thing. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Betty.
First of all, thank you for the conversation. I'm really important. And, you know, it's scary to talk. When you think about something like identity, because it's saying it's so complex, starting from just within an individual and their lineage, but then within time, right? And that complexity, when you think about it, the flag itself, how it's flattened, right? So in order to label, there is an essential flattening necessary,
Yeah.
right? I mean, just in the sense of the flag, you know, the national culture with all of its, you know, varieties and different histories is represented by 3 colors and this one symbol, right? And first of all, just in the show, I love how you start that, you know, like I was saying earlier, and stitching the different parts, denying like the usual protocol of showing the flag, you know, that's also regular, right? How it's folded, how it's stored, how it is flung, right? The fact that you brought in, like, you know, the lines are not straight. They're falling over, they're folding over, they're sleeping, they're breaking, they're on the ground.
Yeah.
So all of that already flattens and complicates stuff. But aside from that comment, the question is something I think about, you know, about how all these things that we're talking about are kind of overrepresented from the point of view of the U.S. And how that is actually exploited globally, you know, and the power that the U.S. has to be in, or discussions within the U.S. can not really about it, right? So these ideas of identity or even the labels don't just stay here, but they're kind of, you know, exported out, you know, and like, you know, I think the U.S. gets away with not thinking of itself as an empire. I mean, that's historically, that's like that too, but in a way it's the worst kind of empire because it's even more powerful because its power is insidious, right? And it has a lot of power due to the heavy subsidizing of its academia and how we decide how we are, our labels, the hyper labels, the sub-level, you know, labels. And yeah, I want to know, like, you're working with you as well, and working with the hero. What do you all think about that power of the U.S., the idea of that X coming out from here, you know, and then having to go somewhere else where people have to contend with it, like any kind of U.S. like imperial exports.
Anybody want to start?
I just wanted to, I think we talked about this, and I wanted you to you wanted to expound on it. But you talked about what Americanness is.
Yeah.
And I wanted to speak for you, if you wanted to. Like, I remember you said something like Americanness in your artist statement, or you talked about it afterwards. Is it's like it's sort of related to whiteness, but I was thinking about Americanness as how you said it. It's like it's flexible, and it takes what it needs conveniently, and gives away what it doesn't need conveniently. Sort of like whiteness does. That whiteness does that as well. I think kind of takes and discards actually as it's convenient. So I think in this larger idea of what like America's history has, it's flexible. Right?
It's totally flexible. I mean, there are versions of it all over. We talk about it, like critical race theory is a version of that right now, with the way the conversation is in education, or how you can't say gay if you're in a various school district, but it's like it is what's convenient at the time. Because I mean, I think we're in regions, right? We're sort of not really the South, but we're this other Southwest. But what does that mean? And even in the state, like I remember moving here. So I've been coming to Texas my whole life, and it's always been very specific. Colleen, I would come visit my uncle when he was at UT, and then I would go to Brackett. So I had a very sort of different and disparate experience. But then when I moved here, I noticed like everybody has like not everyone, many people have like a tattoo of the state on their body, and I was always like, I don't understand what that means. And it's taken me 10 years to sort of understand there's this notion of I feel like Texas is a small version of the empire of the United States, right? But then I think like, oh yeah, I used to go to the Alamo, and I would like tour the Alamo, and it was fantastic. And now I'm like, I hate the Alamo. I don't want to go to the Alamo. And why are we going to the Alamo? And so I think like there's a lot of that. When it's convenient, we appropriate, right? So like if you're traveling somewhere perceived as dangerous, to say that you're an American kind of protects you, right? And then if you want to shed that sort of identity, you sort of appropriate language, you change the way that you dress, you associate with different types of groups. And I think there's small pockets and versions of that in our city, in this state, but then all over the country. And I think, and in all honesty, that's my world experience, right? Because like you talked about the code switching, like I had to be able to be in a small town where in a homestead where everybody spoke Spanish, and like I understood but I didn't understand, and I knew I related because I looked just like all these people, but I was the other because I didn't live there. And then I would go somewhere else, and as an adult I traveled the world and been spoken to in a variety of languages because I just kind of have a multiplicity look about me. But that is, you know, in honor of my parents, I would say, right? So I think, yeah, I don't know. I don't exactly know how that will sort of find itself in work as we move, as like I keep continue to make it, but it's definitely something I'm thinking about.
Oh, I wanted to weigh in on the idea of the American perspective projected outward. I'll try to get to your question. So in Gloria's book, she talks about the skull, the cut of the idea of artwork in Western culture and U.S. Western. Of it being killed, like we kill it and we put it in a museum or an art space. It deadens it, we label it, and this is the year, and then preserve it. Like, I've always thought that way, and when I was revisiting the work, I was like, yes, it's because I always talk about my own work as like this little fellow or this guy or whatever, and she talks about that in terms of like the native culture, artwork being more. We anthropomorphize it.
Yeah.
It becomes its own entity. It's like I have to dress it, or I have to tend it, I have to take care of it, or whatever. And so there's that clash, obviously, of Western dialogues that are happening here. And funny enough, I was just listening to an interview of a jazz philosopher talking about the blues being one of the most critical developments in music simply because up until about that time when blues was developed, from a Western perspective, we had the Euclidean model, which was music is math. Like this note refers to that note, refers to that note, and to get the note, you need to repeat. And as we expanded and explored, there were other cultures like African music, Chinese music, where there wasn't that math background, but it was more of a feel and kind of like a rhythm, and you just went with it. And blues music is what combines Western, Eastern, to where you get the bend note, you get the treble that kind of doesn't hit. It's not quite on beat, but it's good. It feels good. And so I think we need to explore those avenues where they actually become a new thing as opposed to this is that was this, and we'll keep it separated. So I think your work is kind of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in that because I think, like, I mean, I'm an academic, so I live in the space of, like, how do I talk to young people about the work that they make, and, like, we are still using the European model as the place to begin, but it's like, how do you insert other artists or other work or other conversations? And I think, like, this idea of the slip note, like, the way that you can slide between is what's important, because then it's like the whole idea of craft can be elevated. I think we're doing that, but I think what we haven't yet done is like, or maybe it's happening, is like, how do we also then have this conversation maybe about like Latinx without always deciding that it has to be existing within a stereotype of what other people think Latinx should be. And I think that's a place where, like, we've always talked about stuff like that, and I think it happens in the conversations, and when people are looking for it, they will find it, but it's when it becomes more ubiquitous, and it isn't yet there yet, but I don't know, because I was thinking a lot about, I tried to fold some of the flags, and I was thinking about the piece that you and Adriana made, what the green screen flag, and I was like, what is this flag that's folded, and why do you fold it? And I was trying to figure out, like, it doesn't always exist because someone has died, but it does exist as a way to preserve, and so, like, you know, how can it hover in between? And I know Sterling would push me all the time about, like, you can't just have a flag be a flag. I don't know what that means, but I'm trying to figure that out. But I think it's like that space between. So then to me, it's like, yeah, sitting at my sewing machine at a dinner table, like stitching stuff together allows for that slippage. Because it's not art at that point, right? It's just I can refer to it as a practice, like it's just a thing you do all the time, and so therefore we can start to question the practice, which I think, like in European painting, if we think about the historical nature of it, like it critiqued itself at some point, right? Like when we start to talk about like early 20th century or even earlier, when we're sort of questioning the mode of the image as this thing to look into, like a window into another world. And we live in a great time where art doesn't have to do that, right? It can kind of be many things at once, and so I don't know.
The key is finding places to distribute that.
Yeah.
So that the conversation can be as broad as the thinking that we're going to. You do it in a vacuum. It has obviously less force and less impact. And if we rethink the means of distribution, and that's starting to happen now because of virtual versus actual experience, but we who are thinking creatively, I don't mean say in an art world, just anybody who's thinking creatively and looking for slippages and looking to move beyond boundaries that are imposed by various systems, have to find a way to reach that outward. That's critical. Otherwise, just as obviously the oldest person on the panel, I've lived through generations of this, and I've been in this moment before.
Yeah.
In the 70s. Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to collectively figure out how to push this past commerce and capitalism, make it live on a stage that can be seen. I don't know what the answers are, we all come up with that, but that's got to happen for this class.
Yeah. It does. Yeah.
Not to make you feel responsible.
No, but I do think that this word is very subversive now. The idea of a flag. And going back to what Betty was saying about, you know, the idea that the U.S. exports out to the world. Well, they think they're exploiting a certain message, but the rest of the world doesn't receive it.
Right.
You know, they know what's really here, what's going on. I mean, they're sitting there watching our political situations, eating their popcorn, and we're like, wow, this is entertaining. But like, you know, like when I go visit friends in Mexico, I'm still a gringo, you know, because I was born here. And so like, as much as I want to say I'm this or that, they have their own, the rest of the world has their own ideas of what's going on.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that was one of the things about the show, and like as work started to get sort of come out, that I got less freaked out about how sort of personal it would be because of what you're saying. Like, I can't know what everybody else is going to say or how they're going to label it. I just know that this is sort of my experience, and I know that, like, I know I'm old enough to know that I'm not the only one having that experience, but it still doesn't make it sort of easy, and but it also makes it easier to like be okay with like Mexico City, or you know, like the oddball person out in your family, or I don't know, whatever, the only person in the room kind of thing.
I mean, there are people who just even with the language, the Spanish language, you know, they're very like, oh, you know, you don't know Spanish or Mexican.
Yes.
But it's like, Spanish came from Spanish. So it's like, it's Europe. Yeah. So it's like, there's a,
Yeah.
it's Europe also.
I mean, isn't that part of the complication of the of what Latinx, like it widens and deadens?
There's so much.
There's like indigenous.
Latinx is,
Yeah.
when I applied for the job that I have now in Mexico, I was asked what are your feelings about Latinx? Because it is such like a, it's riddled with all kinds of American like, constructs, like trying to flatten like the masculine, we talked about the Spanish. A lot of Mexican people don't use it because their grandmas don't use it.
Yeah.
I understand that. I understand it's trying to be more open, be more accessible. But yeah, it's complicated. It's very academic.
Yeah.
Which is also like problematic. Because only who has access to that kind of language and that kind of context. But I was thinking about your work. You know, we talked briefly when we discussed this earlier. We talked with the artist about how like looking at these kind of words, or these kind of in the situation of like identity, or being like in a hybrid sort of identity, you feel like you're like both things but not at the same moment.
Yeah.
Which I just find really interesting. I find it really interesting with your work, personally, on a personal level. I look at it and I go, yes and no at the same time, neither, both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like those three flags in the kind of the middle are definitely an exploration of that. They're like an Ancestry.com DNA breakdown of like of my ancestry, and they're representative of my parents and of myself, and so. And and I find the irony in it hilarious, because my father's Jewish, his family comes from a vast region in Russia and Ukraine and this whole sort of like the Pale of Russia, and he's 100% yellow. So he's pure. And so the title of those pieces are authentication. The authentication flags are this idea of authentic, and a running joke in my family, and I think Doris heard me say this before, is like, we would always try to go to the most authentic in the title Mexican restaurant, you know, wherever we lived, or whatever, a Chinese restaurant, didn't matter, because it was never going to be any of those things. It was always going to be whatever the region version of what they think Mexican food might be, and so it was that. And so, and then my mother's flag is the one that starts with green, and so hers is like a representation of colonizers. It's like indigenous colonizers. And so it's like, oh, like this idea or notion of pure, anglicized, Hispanicized, it is unreal. We know this intellectually, but emotionally in your town, in your home, or whatever, we don't. And so it's really kind of ridiculous, I feel like.
It's interesting, you know, Betty mentioned it, you know, the kind of flag flattens. And those three flags represent something about you, but they're not nearly all of you.
Right.
You know, there's very small part of who you are.
Yeah, they're odd because they track you biologically.
Right,
And it's cultural, whatever your experience.
right,
And that's very important.
yeah,
Like culture is huge. It's a huge part of identifying.
yeah.
That's just data.
Yeah, that's just data.
It's just data, but you know, like, I was talking to Yulia, she had to go, but Yulia, we were talking about, how Jewish you are was determined by Hitler's idea of like who you were related to. So, like, if your grandparents are Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father was Jewish, you're Jewish. It doesn't, you're wearing the star, you're identified, you are, you know, and so it's like, in some ways, the data drove, all, you know, like, and so it is equally representative, but I also agree with you, it's devoid of culture, which,
It's like flags, like the flag means like mapping.
yeah,
So it's the idea of, I forget what the philosophical angle of it is, but the territory is not the map. In other words, if you were to map something and include everything in the map, it would have to be a one-to-one map. Like you couldn't make a map without omitting something.
right,
You can't make a map to a handleable label without having stuff on. And so that's what the flag is. Flag.
yes, yeah.
So,
So these are problems of representation. On every level.
Yeah, which I think is code switching really. Like, because we've all learned how to navigate. It's very explicit, yeah.
I think we also forget like time and place, right? Because this is a picture now, and also we tend to think that things are being neutral, like this data is not neutral because it overrepresents some things because they have information about that. So that's why they're able to tell you this and that, but it's missing most of the information. So
It-
at another time, they would have another picture and we'd be able to break it down.
Yes,
right?
and
So,
as more and more people are sort of open to this idea of sending your DNA and just
Yeah.
have an institution like collect it,
Yeah.
it gets more specific.
yeah, there's
So it's
more
always
sample.
dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like in that saying, there's representation, there's time and place, like we were saying, and then what Roberto was saying earlier too, like, what is the logic that you are using to identify something? You know, you're looking at, like you're saying, the blues as being not a continuation of kind of the classical music, you know, with its specifics, and seeing it like a, you know, not realizing that it's operating under its own logics and it comes from a different actual mathematical system. You know, and then the certain things being overrepresented, they almost become the proxy, and then we assume they're neutral. When they're not.
I like
never
that.
neutral.
Yeah.
I get that.
There is no neutral.
There is no neutral, right? I mean, like you said, the map is being confused the territory, right? I mean, like, it's just what's been mapped out, like, there's a whole bunch of land and also it's who mapped it, you know?
But, so I in 2019, I guess I was at the Tallgrass Prairie in Kansas, and so my inclination to go there was because it's this migratory pattern, like eons old, and it's also like the last 2% of the Tallgrass Prairie that's available. It's owned by the United States, so it's a national preserve, and so we could like walk through the preserve and I kept, that's where these flags started, really. It was like how to, like sort of like sticking a flag on the moon, like this idea of appropriation of territory that, but I came across a flag, I mean a map from pre-1824, so this is like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, so like all the Western territory is like indigenous or Hispanicized, and so, it's real fascinating to look at a map like that because like embedded in our understanding of what the United States looks like is like, you know, all the states, but then to recognize and then to know what had to happen in order for that territory to become the United States. I think that's the thing that's lost the most when we start to see these symbols of flatness. Yeah.
What it takes to make a flag, you know, I mean, and then, to me, like, someone who's from East Africa specifically did, and it's just like a history, you know, it's like, it's everywhere, empire is empire. In order to make a flag and say us, some horrible thing is going down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the concept of flag as an icon of identity, and how problematic it is in that it tries to like put forth an idea, and that's very much an ideal, but the reality of it will never match that. It's always an approximation. So that there's a lot of history and trauma and so much associated with it that you can never, it can never reach that idea. It's always an approximation. And thinking back to how lovely the work is, so kind of reimagining the flag, kind of deconstructing it and reimagining it in a new way.
Yeah.
It makes me think about, thinking of identity as there are so many threads that make up the tapestry of each person's identity.
Yes.
And over time, it's fluid. You will like highlight one thread over another, or kind of hide it at one point in your life, and then you feel better or differently about it, and then you bring some others to the forefront. And what you put out there is not what other people may perceive or define you as.
Yeah.
So it's very complicated, but very, very interesting.
I mean, two things come to mind. One of them is like the use of the idea, like entering it into this through the notion of the military. Like I would think, my father's a historian, and so thinking about the documents of our history, so like the Constitution, the preamble, and things, and like how idealized those are, and we still aspire to them 200 and some odd years later, and it's like, God, we're really not that close. And so, and then the other part of that is thinking about what you were saying about incorporating my kids. Like, I definitely think about what experience my children have, especially since like one of them has been given a name that is a specific type of identifier, whereas the other one has not been, which is like a weakness of mine, right? Like I'm grasping for a name that's been stripped away. And then also within the construct of, like you talked about with Robert, like the idea of colorism, even within my family, there's like an array. And so hearing my children grapple with what that means for them is interesting, because I can't, my husband's white, so like I can't say that he's bad. He's not bad. He's amazing. He's out there watching all these kids right now. but I definitely want my children to have an understanding of what it means to be an American in this country with our history, and the complexity of what it took for like his family to be here, or my family to be here, and now they are here. And then within that, like one is very, very white, and the other one is more like use chocolate, like mocha color, like a latte color. And so they even navigate the world differently, to the point where one of my children is asked if I am their mother continuously. So it's like, what is that about? So I think like we're always reflecting back stuff that we see, but like I feel like it's my job to help empower them. And I think like maybe this work is a part of that conversation. That's why it's still, like I feel the need to make it. But then I also think like, yeah, it's still a part of my own struggle with what it means. Or maybe it's part of my own struggle with helping other people understand that it is very complicated, and that it isn't just one like easy thing.
One of the strengths I really see in your work is you are really trying to deeply occupy and define the space of hybridity, liminality. And I think it's interesting that these symbols that you're talking about, symbols are prisms of meaning that, of course, are subjective. How we understand the American flag is seen through the prism of identity, kind of layered under the cultural dominance of whatever nationality you come from. So I think it's interesting that you're using cyanotype, and I was curious about that choice and using something that's so, it's about light and shadow, how you're thinking about rendering the flag in that way.
Because it's a construct, the idea that things are made, impressions are made through the reduction of or the exposure to was important with the use of cyanotype. And then it was also kind of easy in the sense of its mobility. I could like prep material and take it with me. So because most of the things that, well, all of these pieces that have cyanotype, they've been processed outside with gravel, dirt, or sand, whatever, from much of it's from like, well, the areas around Central Texas, but also the tallgrass prairie. And so, like, I could literally put it in my backpack and take it with me and then be out wherever I was and expose it. But I also like that it's very graphic, like this, the Donde Soy, the one with the American flag at the top, like, it's graphic, we sort of read it quickly as a reference to the American flag. The color is obviously wrong, but then at the same time, like, it's an abstraction of what it, I mean, in many ways, like literally because it's not the American flag, but then it's an abstraction of what it is because it's made out of things that are cast shadows, which I feel like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is like that. And so, I don't know, I really like cyanotype for that reason, but not as like, I also, and this is sort of naive, but like, I also like it for the idea that like, it's this moment in this sunlight that's exposing and illuminating this image. So it's like all in one, there isn't a negative, and there's no way, there's no intermediary, there's no way to like process it later.
I think I like how that embeds that, of course, these symbols, I love that you brought this up as well, are embedded with time.
Yeah.
And how I perceive the American flag is very different from the way my parents do and their grandparents did. And I think, especially right now, a lot of people are shifting the way they're thinking about nationalism, American nationalism, and also becoming more aware, of course, that there are transnational interpretations of Americanization. America is such a global power that almost no matter where you are in the world, there's an idea of what that flag means. And I like how, if you're thinking about light and embedding that with place, like the objects from the place, the ground, and the soil that you're in. I was just really curious about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much. The last thing I'll say, and because the one behind us is, it's like a quilt kind of, but it's made from remnants from all of these. But it's also like my grandmother's house, and so it's like a topographical view. Like, I love the idea that Google, is it weird also that Google drives around and takes pictures of everything? Like, you can drive by your house and it's an image of your house 6 months ago before you fixed your yard or before you painted your house, and so like you can also go look at your grandmother's house, go look at the house you lived at when you were a little kid. Like, I like this idea that there's this accessibility, but it's also like another sort of reflection, or like it's a weird lens because it's not real, and it's like it's not capturing my memory, right? It's just capturing this thing at the moment. So I don't know. So anyway, it's like an abstraction of her house. So literally, it's like the blue is the backyard where the trees are, and then the white is kind of the house, and then this is sort of like the road, sort of sidewalk area. But I spent a lot of time there, and like the idea of the notion of wrapping myself in her place, or going back to this place, but then the place doesn't really exist. Like it's a whole different thing, and I don't know. And then the red in it are places where the blue cyanotype didn't stitch evenly because they're all remnants, and so the red slivers of American flag sort of stitch those things together. So in some ways, it very much does all the things that we've been talking about today.